Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Sasha could no longer sit quietly while the layers of deception in her life were peeled back one by one under the blinding scrutiny of what had become the most explosive courtroom battle Port Charles had ever seen. She sat there, her hands trembling and her heart thudding in her chest, as the truth began to unfold, not on her terms, but on Nina's. It was a sickening realization that clawed at her gut with unrelenting force. Nina, the woman she once considered a maternal figure, had deliberately revealed to Rick the true paternity of the child Sasha was carrying, Michael's child. This was not an accidental slip of the tongue. It was calculated. Precise. Ruthless. It was betrayal not just of trust, but of Sasha's autonomy, her right to her own truth. That revelation, dropped like a bomb in the middle of an already volatile custody trial, forced Sasha to testify under oath, robbing her of any chance to control her own narrative and placing her squarely in the middle of a war she never intended to be part of. The sting of Nina's betrayal did not just pierce her heart, it burned through her soul. It wasn't just about loyalty anymore, it was about the cold, surgical way Nina had used her. Sasha had thought there was hope for Nina to change, to evolve into someone capable of compassion and redemption. She had offered her grace, had forgiven past transgressions, had tried to believe that people could choose better paths. But that hope was shattered now, like fragile glass dropped onto a marble floor, breaking into sharp, irreparable fragments. Nina hadn't just told the truth, she had weaponized it. She had done it not out of concern, but out of manipulation, to shift the tide of the custody battle between Michael and Willow in favor of her own ambitions, her own selfish vision of control. In doing so, she had reduced Sasha to nothing more than a pawn, a disposable means to an end. And yet, as Sasha struggled to pick up the pieces of that betrayal, she found herself holding a far more volatile secret. One that, if exposed, would make the chaos surrounding her seem like mere tremors before the true earthquake. Nina had been sleeping with Drew. The same Drew who had professed undying love for Willow. The same Drew who stood before the court and spoke of moral character, integrity, and the sanctity of family. And Nina, Willow's biological mother, had gone behind her daughter's back and violated the deepest boundaries of familial trust. It was a truth so incendiary, so destructive, that Sasha could barely contain the weight of it inside her. Every time her gaze drifted across the courtroom and settled on Willow, pale, anxious, clutching to hope like a raft in a storm, Sasha's chest tightened. She could see the confusion in Willow's eyes, the cracks forming beneath the surface of her composure as she fought to believe in the man who had already begun slipping away from her emotionally. Sasha's conscience was in a brutal tug-of-war. To remain silent meant leaving Willow trapped in a lie, anchored to a love that had already betrayed her in secret. It meant continuing the cycle of deception that had plagued so many lives in Port Charles. But to speak, oh, to speak, would be to torch everything. Willow's heart. Her sense of security. Her trust in both her mother and the man she believed would be her partner for life. It would be like throwing a lit match into a room soaked in gasoline, knowing full well the destruction that would follow. Love, loyalty, even the faintest glimmers of hope, they would all be consumed by the firestorm that truth would bring. And Sasha, already isolated and weary, would have to live with the knowledge that she lit the spark. There was no right choice, only the lesser of two devastations. And time was slipping away. The court was moving forward with its proceedings. Lawyers barked arguments. Witnesses took the stand. Judges listened, impassive. And through it all, Sasha sat in silence, the secret clawing at her throat. She remembered what it felt like to be blindsided by the truth. To feel the world tilt under her feet. To realize she had been nothing more than a chess piece in someone else's game. She didn't want to do that to Willow. But neither could she justify letting Drew and Nina keep hiding behind their masks while others paid the price for their duplicity. She stood once, outside the courthouse, staring blankly at the horizon, her arms wrapped tightly around her swelling belly. The wind bit through her jacket, but she didn't move. She could feel the baby shift inside her, a fluttering reminder of innocence amidst chaos. And in that quiet moment, she asked herself the only question that mattered. What kind of mother would she be if she chose silence over truth? What kind of future was she shaping for her child if she allowed lies to keep rotting the foundation of the world they were about to enter? Sasha knew that once the truth was spoken, it could not be unspoken. The courtroom would erupt. Willow would crumble. Drew would be exposed. Nina's web of control would unravel. And the battle lines would be redrawn once again in blood and betrayal. But maybe, just maybe, truth could be the first step toward real healing. Not just for Sasha. Not just for Willow. But for all the children growing up in Port Charles, surrounded by secrets, half-truths, and carefully curated facades. And so Sasha remained still, the weight of choice pressing down on her shoulders like the heaviest rope. Whether or not she would expose Nina and Drew remained uncertain. But one thing was clear, Sasha was no longer a pawn. She was the wild card. The one person who could rewrite the narrative with a single sentence. And that power, terrifying, humbling, and absolute, rested in her hands. In the private conference that followed the court proceedings, the air still thick with the acrid residue of legal warfare and emotional scorches, Sasha stood at the precipice of revelation. Every breath she took felt like inhaling the smoke of burnt trust, her pulse echoing the residual tension of a courtroom that had just witnessed a confession capable of shifting everything. As the attorneys exchanged glances and whispered strategy, and as the judge's absence allowed for a brief lull in the formalities of justice, Sasha found herself staring into the abyss of decision. Her lips parted slightly, the weight of the secret pressing hard against her ribcage, ready to burst forth like a dam finally giving way under relentless pressure. She could feel the words rising up in her throat, sharp and trembling, threatening to expose the tangled truth about Nina and Drew in front of those who had the most to lose, and the most to feel. But just as the silence stretched too long and the room seemed to lean in with anticipation, Rick caught her eye. His expression was subtle, almost casual to the untrained observer, but to Sasha, it was a loaded warning. A flick of the eyebrow, the narrowing of his gaze, the tightening of his jaw, each movement a reminder that words, especially hers, could be twisted into weapons, sharpened and turned back against her with ruthless precision. She understood the implication. Rick was telling her that once truth left her lips, it would no longer belong to her. It would become a tool, a headline, a legal strategy, a scandal. And it would no longer serve justice, it would serve agendas. Yet amid the power plays and legal maneuvering, Sasha's eyes met Willow's, and what she saw there was not strength or clarity, but fragility. Willow sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, her expression unreadable but her eyes screaming questions she couldn't voice. She was a woman at the epicenter of too many storms. A daughter betrayed by a mother she barely knew, a partner misled by a man she trusted, and a mother fighting desperately to preserve a semblance of normalcy for her children. She was surrounded by people who claimed to be allies but held secrets like daggers behind their backs. In that moment, Sasha saw not just Willow's uncertainty but her isolation. And it tore her apart. Sasha was painfully aware that if she chose silence, she would be complicit in the web of lies already strangling Willow's world. She would be allowing the betrayal to continue unchecked, enabling Nina and Drew to operate behind a facade of remorse and redemption. But if she spoke, if she dared to crack the mask, she would be unleashing a flood she could not control. The fallout would not be limited to Nina's disgrace or Drew's unmasking. The courtroom would implode with competing narratives and emotional fallout. Sasha herself, already at the center of a media circus because of her pregnancy and the mysterious paternity bombshell, would become even more vulnerable to scrutiny, judgment, and public dissection. In a world where perception shaped outcomes, especially in custody trials, any misstep could cost her everything. And so, she stood frozen between truth and survival, caught in the storm's eye. Around her, the currents swirled with quiet but lethal intent. Carly, ever the strategist, sat in calculated silence, her eyes moving across the room like a chess master reading the board. She was studying Sasha, reading her body language, waiting for a slip, a confession, a crack in the armor that she could weaponize. Sonny, though outwardly calm, had already begun questioning Sasha's silence, dissecting her every move for motive. He didn't like loose ends, and Sasha had become one. Volatile and unpredictable. Jason, the observer, had been watching from the edges as well. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. He was already piecing together a narrative, quietly chasing the inconsistencies in the paternity timeline, trying to understand the full scope of the manipulation that had poisoned the courtroom. He didn't have the proof yet, but Sasha suspected he was closer than anyone realized. And Rick, the orchestrator of so many legal landmines, remained relentless. His presence was like a vice tightening around Sasha's conscience. He knew she held power, enough to change the course of the trial, perhaps even the future of multiple families. And that knowledge made him dangerous. The pressure mounted with every breath, every tick of the clock echoing off the paneled walls of the conference room. Sasha felt her body weaken under the invisible weight she bore. Her shoulders, though squared with resolve, trembled slightly under the burden of carrying truths no one else had the courage, or the recklessness, to voice. Her child, growing silently inside her, represented innocence in a world corrupted by secrets and strategies. And Sasha, above all, wanted to protect that innocence. This wasn't just about courtroom drama or maternal loyalty anymore. It was about setting a precedent for the life she was about to bring into the world. Could she raise a child with integrity while hiding truths that tore others apart? Could she model strength if she allowed fear and manipulation to dictate her choices? These questions haunted her far more than any cross-examination could. Because in the quiet after the chaos, when the cameras were gone and the court had adjourned, Sasha would still have to live with the consequences of what she chose to say, or not say. There would be no applause, no absolution. Just the knowledge that a moment of courage, or a moment of silence, had determined the fate of not only herself but of a mother, a daughter, a partner, and a child. And deep down, Sasha knew that time was running out. The secret wouldn't stay buried forever. Sooner or later, truth had a way of surfacing, clawing its way into the light. But when it did, would she be seen as the woman who protected it, or the woman who let it rot in the shadows? She closed her eyes, just for a second, to block out the noise and see the future she wanted. One where her child would grow up in a world less shaped by lies than the one she now stood in. That vision, fleeting and delicate, was the only clarity she had. And it would have to be enough, for now. In the stillness of a private antechamber that overlooked the long, sterile hallway leading back to the courtroom, Sasha stood frozen beside the tall window, her silhouette framed by the afternoon light that spilled across the linoleum floor. The murmur of voices from beyond the closed door had faded, replaced by the distant echo of footsteps, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the rhythmic beat of her own heart pounding beneath the tension lodged deep in her chest. Her hands, trembling yet steady in their resolve, gently cradled her growing belly, as if seeking comfort, wisdom, or perhaps even silent permission from the unborn child she carried. It was not just a maternal instinct that guided her hands there, but a symbolic act, one that tethered her to something more profound than the chaos unraveling around her. She was searching for something pure to hold on to in a world that seemed to be slipping further into moral quicksand. She stared out through the glass, but she did not see the hallway. What she saw instead were the spiraling consequences of every choice before her. What had begun as a trial about custody, about legal rights and parental fitness, had now become something much darker, something primal. This wasn't just a battle over who would raise Amelia and Wiley. This had become a brutal war between truth and deceit, between loyalty and betrayal, between protection and destruction. The stakes had transcended courtroom jargon and legal strategy. Now, they were soaked in emotional blood, bonds broken, trust shattered, futures rewritten with the cruel ink of manipulation. Nina had already cast her die, aligning herself with deception cloaked as concern, with secrecy painted as protection. She had exposed Michael as the father of Sasha's unborn child, not out of altruism or justice, but out of strategy. She had sold that truth as a weapon, delivering it into the hands of Rick Lansing to twist and contort into something damaging, something tactical. That move had forced Sasha into the witness stand, ripped away her agency, and transformed her into a pawn in a war she hadn't consented to fight. And yet, it was not that betrayal alone that threatened to splinter everything, it was the deeper betrayal, the more insidious secret Sasha now carried like a ticking time bomb in her heart. The affair between Nina and Drew was not some harmless mistake. It was a betrayal that cut through layers of trust and innocence. It was the quiet dagger that had pierced the back of Willow, a woman who had endured more loss, more abandonment, more heartbreak than most could survive. And now, Sasha held the power to protect Willow from further devastation, or to expose her to a truth that might finally break her. She could see it so clearly. The moment Willow would learn that the man she loved had not only lied about a nurse in Germany but had shared a bed with her estranged mother. The confusion. The hurt. The collapse of everything Willow believed was still sacred. But as Sasha stood there, watching her reflection merge with the hallway beyond the glass, she understood something more terrifying than the consequences of truth. She realized that silence was not safety. Silence was complicity. It was allowing the infection to spread beneath the surface, quietly, insidiously, until it consumed everything. And in that realization, she came face to face with a decision that would redefine her, whether to be a vessel of truth or a guardian of secrets. She thought of Michael, who had fought so hard for his children, yet had become a casualty of half-truths and half-love. She thought of Drew, whose public integrity stood in grotesque contrast to his private betrayals. She thought of Nina, whose obsession with control had driven her to sacrifice anything and anyone, even her own daughter. But most of all, she thought of Willow, sitting in that courtroom, trying desperately to piece together a family from fragments of a life torn apart by the people she trusted most. And then, she thought of the future, of Amelia and Wiley, of her own unborn child, of the world they would inherit. What values would shape their lives? What truths would they be told? What lies would haunt them long after this courtroom was emptied and its judgments rendered? Sasha didn't have all the answers, but she knew this: children deserved better. They deserved to be born into a world where truth wasn't a bargaining chip, where love wasn't a mask for manipulation, where family meant safety, not sacrifice. A tear rolled slowly down her cheek, but her expression remained calm, resolute. This moment wasn't about fear anymore. It wasn't even about self-preservation. It was about breaking the cycle. It was about refusing to let another generation grow up poisoned by the sins of the last. It was about ensuring that when her child asked about right and wrong, she wouldn't have to hesitate before answering. Sasha closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her hands still resting gently on the life inside her. She knew now that the decision before her wasn't simply hers to make, it was a legacy to choose. And when she stepped back into that courtroom, the path she walked would shape not just her fate, but the fates of Willow, Michael, Drew, Nina, and the children caught in the undertow of secrets they never asked to be born into. Nina had chosen her side. Now it was Sasha's turn.